In 2009, the company M2 developed 3 games based on Konami franchises: Contra ReBirth, Gradius ReBirth, and Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth. However, in 2009, when WiiWare was closed down, these games would never become possible to play again unless you already had them. Are these games really gone forever, and were these worth checking out? Let's take a look. What's going on? It's Pojer coming at you with another video. Alright, so if you've seen a couple of my videos and you like what I do, hit the subscribe button right there. That way, you'll be notified whenever I make a new video. Also, we're really close to 15k, so let's close it out. I also wanted to mention I do make an appearance in FeralInferno's latest video about Castlevania. I have a 4-minute segment in it, so it's basically a mini Pojer episode. If you want to check it out, well, you'll have to go to his channel. I'll put a link right in the description. There's also some excellent content creators featured in the video as well, such as BigReecey, TheMadBelmont, and FeralInferno himself. If you like their work, definitely drop them a subscription. Alright, let's talk about the Rebirth games on WiiWare. One of the best features of the Nintendo Wii was the Shop channel. Within it was Wii Virtual Console. This was a service where you could purchase retro games on various consoles, even some that were from the competitors. It had most of the classic games that you would expect, and Nintendo would continuously add games. This was my favorite feature of the Wii, and was a great way to relive some of your favorite retro games. But Virtual Console was not the only service available. There was also WiiWare. It was another service where you could download games, but these were brand new titles that were made specifically for the Wii. For example, Mega Man 9 was a downloadable game that resembled the NES prequels, although this was not a real NES game. But Mega Man would not be the only series to get a revival. In 2009, the company M2 struck a deal with Konami to develop remakes of some of their beloved franchises for WiiWare. From this agreement, we would get Contra ReBirth, Gradius ReBirth, and Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth. M2 has a very impressive resume. Years later in 2009, M2 would develop the Genesis Mini, which was a very impressive collection of games, and they even developed their own Genesis title for it. In 2020, they developed Namco Museum Archives, where they developed the NES version of GAP Plus from scratch. This company really knows what they're doing, so it's a very good sign that they're behind these Rebirth games. Because these titles were only released on WiiWare, when the online service was discontinued in 2019, we lost the ability to play these games. Your only way of playing them today is if you happen to download the games when they were still possible. Except, thanks to the preservation community, the ROM files for all 3 games were extracted, and it's still possible to play these games today using the Dolphin emulator. So with that said, let's check them out. First, we'll take a look at Contra ReBirth. The Contra series started going through a rough patch where the older games on 8-bit and 16-bit consoles were excellent, but the games after it were questionable. Resurrecting a somewhat dead franchise is a difficult task, so how will M2 handle it? The game is very faithful to the originals. It's a run and gun game where you can collect weapon upgrades and then fight the boss at the end. The game seems to take the most inspiration from Contra 3, as you can carry up to 2 weapons at once and all the guns are automatic. Even your character kinda looks like he does in that game. The controls feel exactly like the originals. You can shoot in 8 different directions, and you're able to shoot diagonally while standing still. You can't select both weapons at the same time like you could in Contra 3 though. Speaking of weapons, most of the familiar weapons are here, but there's a couple that are missing, like the flame gun and the sea gun. Very surprising that they didn't add them. You can also select a character when you start the game, although the only difference is in appearance. They don't have any special abilities. I also love the graphic style that they chose for this game. I prefer the 2D look opposed to a 2.5D one. The stages also have a lot of diversity between them. For example, in Stage 4, you're hanging on floating poles that move down through the stage. It's a cool mechanic. At the end of Stage 1, you're jumping on falling airplane parts and fighting a centipede boss. The game does take a lot of inspiration from the previous Contra games. Stage 2 is exactly like the first stage in Contra 3. Stage 5 is exactly like the final stage from the first Contra game. The game also reuses a lot of music from other Contra games. Despite the similarities though, M2 did make enough changes for me to consider this an original title rather than just a remake. While there's a lot of good here, there's a couple things that I don't like. As I mentioned before, it's unfortunate that some of the weapon upgrades are missing. Also, the game is surprisingly short, only 5 stages, unless you count the final boss as a stage, which I don't. To be fair though, the game does have some replayability. There's multiple difficulty settings that you can select and there's unlockable characters. Overall, this is a nice effort from M2. The controls feel exactly like the originals, the 2D graphics look amazing, and I had a blast with this. If M2 were behind games like Contra Operation Galuga, who knows what we would have gotten. Now let's take a look at Gradius ReBirth. I feel like this franchise doesn't get as much attention as Contra does, but like Contra, it also had a presence on 8-bit and 16-bit consoles. It's a shooter with a cool weapon upgrade system. Every time you collect one of these items, the cursor at the bottom advances to the right, and when it reaches the weapon you want, you can select it. The better upgrades, of course, are further to the right, so you need to collect more items to get there. So it's basically a currency system where you can buy upgrades. These upgrades include a speed increase, missiles, an extra projectile, laser, barrier, and more. You can also select what set of weapons you'd like to choose from at the beginning. I personally think the 2A missiles are the best because they have amazing coverage. I also like the force field way more than the barrier because it covers your whole ship and not just the front of it. The controls are spot on. It feels exactly like the original games, and all the weapon upgrades I mentioned earlier are from previous Gradius titles. When using the missile, it automatically fires off while shooting, and I'm glad they went with this control scheme rather than making it a separate button like the arcade Gradius. The music is also excellent. In my opinion, this is the hardest game of the 3. A lot of the enemies hide at the top of the screen, and if you don't have the 2-way missiles or a second projectile that aims above, you have no way of destroying them unless you really try to squeeze in there. The game has unlimited continues, but like all Gradius titles, you lose all your weapon upgrades when you die. You're better off starting from the beginning when you lose because it's very difficult to build up your ship in the middle of a stage. The game has very minimal replayability. There's 5 stages total, which is short, and there's no unlockables, not that I would know what to include as an unlockable for a Gradius game. But the fact that you can select a set of weapons at the beginning might entice you to play a second time. A majority of the levels take inspiration from older Gradius titles. For example, Stage 1 is a lot like the first stage in the original Gradius. Stage 2 is a lot like the first stage from Life Force. Stage 3 has made an appearance in numerous Gradius titles. This game is definitely a bigger offender than Contra ReBirth if we're talking about whether this is a rehash. I would definitely consider this more of a remake than a standout title. Overall, I don't like this one as much as Contra ReBirth, but I still think this is a great game and I definitely had a lot of fun. M2 did a great job capturing the feel of the original Gradius titles. And finally, let's take a look at Castlevania: The Adventure Rebirth. Kinda interesting that it's named after the Game Boy title and not just Castlevania in general. So, full disclosure, I'm not as familiar with the Castlevania series, so I may not be able to comment on similarities to other games. You play as Christopher Belmont, and you must platform your way past enemies to reach the boss. Your default weapon is a whip, but you can collect weapon upgrades like the axe, cross, and holy water. I wasn't sure if they would go with a linear platformer like the original games or a Metroidvania like Symphony of the Night. Thankfully, they went with the former, but there are some levels that have alternate paths. Christopher Belmont's controls are similar to the NES games where you can only use your whip straight in front of you. You cannot aim in multiple directions like you could in Super Castlevania 4. You also can't jump while on the stairs like you could in Bloodlines. His jumping, however, is much better than the NES games. You can control your direction mid-air, which is extremely handy. While it is a bummer that the controls could have been better, they might have been trying to mimic the Game Boy title that it's named after. To use your sub-weapon, you press up and the action button, similar to the NES games. I'm not sure why they did this when there's plenty of buttons on the Wiimote or classic controller to pick from. Having this control scheme makes it difficult to use your sub-weapon when you're near a set of stairs. On the NES, it was understandable because there weren't many buttons to choose from, but here it's not. The level design is excellent. The multiple paths does give this game some variety, and I like that. For example, in Stage 2, I originally thought I was trapped because I didn't collect the key and therefore wasn't able to get through the door. I thought I had to die on purpose, but when I fell down the pit, it brought me to an alternate location. The level design can also be trolly at times. For example, in Stage 4, there's a room full of fire-breathing skeletons. After destroying every single one with my whip, I went over to the other side and found an item that would have killed them in one go. Come on, what a tease. Of the 3 Rebirth games, this one has the best music by far. A majority of these tracks are from the other games in the franchise, but so are the other 2 Rebirth games. You can select your difficulty at the beginning, but there's no unlockables besides a classic mode which changes the controls to match the NES games. It would have been cool if there were unlockable characters like Grant or Alucard. The stages do feel lengthy, and there's 6 of them total, so this is the longest Rebirth game. Overall, I had a blast with this title. I wish the controls were a little better, and more unlockables would have been cool, but the gameplay is fun, the music is excellent, and you do get more content than the other Rebirth games in terms of the amount of levels. If I had to rank each game, I like Contra ReBirth the most. Despite not being the longest, the game feels like an original title rather than just a remake, and there's so much replayability with the difficulty settings and unlockable characters. My second favorite is Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth. This game has more content than the others, and it's a very enjoyable experience. My least favorite is Gradius ReBirth. It's short, there's no unlockable characters, and it feels like a rehash. But I'm not saying it's bad, I mean we're still in 8 out of 10 territory here. My standards are just high because M2 did an excellent job with all 3 of these games. It's unfortunate that these games were never re-released, but thanks to the preservation community, they're not gone forever. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.